Close your eyes for a second and picture this. You have spent 6 years saving every spare dollar. You skipped vacations. You drove a car that needed duct tape on the dashboard. You packed your lunch every single day for 6 years straight. You did all of that because you had a goal, a real, tangible, life-changing goal. A home. Your home. A front porch. Where your kids could play. A backyard where you could grill on Sundays. A mailbox with your last name on it. And then the day finally comes. You sign the papers. You get the keys. You drive to the house with your family packed into a moving truck, and you stand in the driveway and think, we made it. We actually made it. Now imagine that within 24 hours of that moment, someone decides you don't deserve to be there. That's exactly what happened to me. Her name was Linda Marsh. She was the HOA treasurer, the beautification chair, and the self-appointed compliance officer of our little suburban neighborhood. And from the moment she saw our moving truck pull into the driveway, she made it her personal mission to make our lives absolutely unbearable. What followed was 3 years, 3 full years of violation notices, anonymous city complaints, surveillance logs, threats, fines, and a neighborhood war that escalated so far beyond a garden gnome dispute that it eventually ended in court. But here's the thing about people like Linda. They spend so much time trying to control everyone else that they never see the moment when it all turns against them. And when that moment came for Linda Marsh, and that, my friends, is what justice looks like. Stay with me, because this story, every single word of it is true. And the ending is going to make your day. It was a Saturday in early May, and the weather was perfect. One of those blue sky, warm breeze mornings that makes everything feel possible. My wife Sarah and I had been awake since 5 a.m., not because of nerves, but because of pure, childlike excitement. This was the day. After 6 years of saving, planning, and dreaming, we were finally moving into our first home. The house was a 3-bedroom colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac in a community called Maple Ridge Estates. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't even close. But it had a big front yard, a wraparound porch, and a backyard with an oak tree that my daughter immediately claimed as her future treehouse location. To us, it was perfect. The moving truck arrived at 9 a.m. My brother-in-law Marco and 2 of his friends were helping us. Sarah's mom was there to watch the kids. We were loud, we were happy, and we were absolutely not paying attention to the woman standing across the street watching us with her arms crossed. I noticed her around 10 a.m. She hadn't moved. She was just standing on the sidewalk in front of her house, directly across from ours, holding a coffee mug, watching. I figured she was just a curious neighbor. Maybe she was going to come over and introduce herself, welcome us to the neighborhood. I gave her a friendly wave. She did not wave back. About 20 minutes later, she crossed the street. She was in her mid-50s, with hair pulled back so tight it gave her face a permanent expression of mild outrage. She was wearing khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and I promise this is real, a lanyard around her neck with a laminated badge that read, HOA Compliance Officer. She walked right past me, glanced at the moving truck, glanced at the blankets piled on our porch, and then turned to face me with the energy of someone who had been waiting a very long time to deliver some very important news. I'm Linda Marsh, HOA Treasurer, Beautification Chair, and Compliance Officer for Maple Ridge Estates. I'll need you to sign for this. She produced a 47-page spiral-bound document from under her arm and held it out to me. It was the Community Guidelines and Residential Standards Handbook. She had bookmarked several pages with color-coded sticky tabs. I took it from her, a little stunned. I'll need you to read all of it, she continued, but specifically pages 12 through 18, which cover exterior appearance standards, and pages 31 through 34, which cover parking. Your truck is currently positioned at an angle that partially obstructs the community sightline corridor as defined in Section 8. I looked at the truck. It was parked on my driveway. Legally. Normally. Like a truck. It'll be gone by tonight, I said. It needs to be gone by 6 p.m., she said. HOA ordinance. She then spent the next 20 minutes, while my family was actively unloading furniture, walking me through a list of concerns. The moving blankets stacked on the porch railing were visible from the street, which violated Section 11's visual clutter clause. The temporary cardboard boxes we'd placed on the front steps were a trip hazard and aesthetic violation. And the welcome mat that Sarah's mother had laid down at the front door, a cheerful red mat with a sunflower on it, was, according to Linda, a non-approved color and pattern under the entrance aesthetic guidelines, Appendix C. She actually looked it up in the handbook. Right there in front of us, she flipped to Appendix C, pointed at a color swatch guide, and informed us that only earth tones and neutrals were permitted for front entrance accessories. Sarah's mother, a retired school teacher who does not suffer nonsense quietly, opened her mouth to respond. I grabbed her arm. "We'll take a look at the handbook," I said to Linda. "Thanks for stopping by." Linda gave a tight, satisfied smile, turned on her heel, and walked back across the street. I watched her go back into her house, and I noticed, because I was now paying close attention, that she positioned herself at her living room window, where she had a clear view of our driveway. My brother-in-law Marco watched the whole thing. He put his hand on my shoulder. "Bro," he said quietly, "that woman is going to be a problem." I laughed it off. I told him he was overreacting. I told Sarah not to worry about it. I told myself it was just one overzealous neighbor who took her HOA role too seriously. 3 years later, I would look back on that moment and realize that Marco had never been more right about anything in his entire life. Life settled in quickly. We painted rooms, hung pictures, and started making the house feel like a home. Sarah planted a flower bed along the front walkway. Our daughter finally got her tire swing on the oak tree. Our son made 3 friends on the street within the first week. Everything felt right. Then, 3 weeks after move-in day, I came home from work to find a certified mail notice stuck to the front door. I assumed it was something administrative, a utility transfer, maybe a tax document. I signed for it the next morning without thinking much about it. I opened the envelope at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. It was a formal HOA violation notice, 5 pages long, printed on official Maple Ridge Estates letterhead, signed by Linda Marsh in her capacity as compliance officer. The violation? An unauthorized decorative lawn ornament, specifically 1. Ceramic garden gnome, approximately 11 inches tall, painted in non-neutral colors, placed approximately 6 inches outside the approved decorative display zone as defined in Section 14, Paragraph 3B of the Community Guidelines. Fine, $75. I sat there and read it 3 times. I had to be misunderstanding something. The gnome was a gift from Sarah's grandmother. It had lived on her front porch for 30 years before she passed away. Sarah loved that gnome. It was sentimental, and it was sitting completely harmlessly in our front flower bed. I walked outside with the violation notice and a tape measure. I found the reference line in the handbook, a marked boundary zone described in Section 14, and I measured. The gnome was exactly 6.2 inches outside the approved zone. 6 inches, the width of a hand. I moved the gnome 8 inches to the left. Done. 1 week later, a second violation notice arrived. The gnome was now positioned in a way that obstructed the community sightline corridor outlined in Section 22. The specific measurement cited? The gnome was blocking 4% of the corridor view from Linda's driveway. Fine, $100. I brought the gnome inside and put it on the windowsill. 3 days after that, a third violation arrived. My front flower bed, now empty of the gnome, was cited as aesthetically non-compliant with community landscape standards due to irregular plant spacing and absence of centerpiece decorative element. Fine, $50. I could feel my blood pressure rising with every letter. I went to a garden center, and spent an entire Saturday replanting the flower bed from scratch, with plants specifically listed as approved in the HOA handbook. Petunias, marigolds, ornamental grass, all from the approved list, all in the approved color palette. 2 weeks later, Linda filed a new complaint. The marigolds, she claimed, were the wrong shade of yellow. The approved shade was warm gold. Mine were bright lemon. She had apparently compared them to a color reference chart she kept in her binder. I went back to the garden center. I explained the situation to the employee helping me. He stared at me for a long moment and then said very quietly, "Sir, that is one of the most insane things I have ever heard." I agreed with him completely. Over the next few months, we received 11 violation notices. 11. They covered things like the shade of our porch light bulb too warm, the placement of a potted plant on our front steps 1 inch too close to the edge, a basketball hoop in the driveway that was visible from the street during non-designated activity hours, and my personal favorite, a wind chime that Sarah had hung on the porch, which Linda claimed produced auditory disturbance in violation of Section 29 Quiet Enjoyment Standards. We paid every fine, we adjusted everything, and every time we adjusted, Linda found something new. It was around this time that I started keeping a log. By the 4th month, something had shifted. The violations were no longer just annoying. They were starting to feel intentional, like they weren't about standards at all, but about something else entirely. Sarah noticed it first. She came into the kitchen one morning and said, very carefully, "I need to show you something. Don't react. Just look." She pointed out the kitchen window toward Linda's house across the street. It was 7:08 a.m. Linda was standing at her living room window, coffee in hand, facing directly toward our house. "She does this every morning," Sarah said. "I've been watching for 2 weeks. She's there every morning between 6:50 and 7:30, just standing there, watching." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Maybe she just likes her morning coffee by the window." "She turns to follow movement," Sarah said. "When you walked to the car yesterday, she tracked you the whole way down the driveway. That week, we installed a video doorbell and a small security camera on the garage. It seemed like a reasonable, prudent thing to do. We were a young family. We'd just bought a house. Security cameras were normal. We weren't doing it to provoke anyone." Within 48 hours, a violation notice was in our mailbox. Our doorbell camera was, according to Linda, invasively angled toward community shared property in violation of Section 41 privacy standards. She had measured the camera's field of view using, and I am not making this up, a protractor. We adjusted the camera angle. She filed again 2 days later. Different angle, same claim. We adjusted again. A third complaint arrived claiming that the camera's small LED indicator light constituted light pollution visible from adjacent properties during nighttime hours. We called the HOA board directly to ask how to resolve this. The board member we reached, a mild-mannered man named Gerald, who was technically the HOA president, told us, in a very tired voice, to try to work it out directly with Linda. He sounded like a man who had been saying that sentence for years and knew it never worked. Then came the notebook. Our next-door neighbor Dave was a quiet, retired postal worker who had lived in Maple Ridge for 11 years. He had watched Linda's behavior from close up for a long time. One evening he knocked on our door, looked over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching, and told us something that made Sarah go pale. At the last HOA meeting, Linda had referenced a personal log she kept of community compliance observations. Dave had caught a glimpse of it. It was a handwritten notebook, actual spiral notebook, not a computer, and it contained dated entries about our household. He described seeing entries like 7:04 a.m., lights on, front bedroom, 6:42 p.m., guests arrived. Unidentified vehicle parked partially on grass. Tuesday, Trash bins left at curb until 9 p.m. Past ordnance retrieval window. We had been in the house for 4 months. The log was 14 pages. Dave told us he wasn't the first. The couple who had lived in our house before us had sold and moved after 8 months. The family 2 doors down had sold 3 years earlier after Linda had filed complaints accusing their teenage son of loitering. He told us quietly that at least 4 families had left Maple Ridge in the last 6 years, and Linda had been involved in some way with all of them. That night, after Dave left, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table and didn't say much for a while. She had tears in her eyes, not from sadness exactly, but from the specific kind of exhaustion that comes when you realize a problem is much bigger than you thought. "I don't want to leave," she said finally. "This is our home. We earned this." "We're not leaving," I told her. I meant it. But I also knew that we couldn't keep playing defense. Something had to change. Year 2 began with a thaw and a false hope. We started to wonder if maybe Linda had grown bored of us or perhaps found a new target. We relaxed a little. We let our guard down. We shouldn't have. In March, a city code enforcement officer knocked on our front door. He was polite, apologetic, and clearly embarrassed to be there. He explained that a complaint had been filed with the city alleging that we had constructed an unpermitted structure on our property without obtaining the required building permits. I asked him what structure he was referring to. He walked around to the side of the house, consulted his clipboard, and pointed at the birdhouse my daughter had built at school. It was a small wooden birdhouse, maybe 10 inches tall, mounted on a post I had set in the garden bed. She had painted it purple with yellow stars. The city inspector looked at it for a long moment, asked him what structure he was referring to. He walked around to the side of the house, consulted his clipboard, and pointed at the birdhouse my daughter had built at school. It was a small wooden birdhouse, maybe 10 inches tall, mounted on a post I had set in the garden bed. She had painted it purple with yellow stars. T. He wrote something on his clipboard. He looked at it again. "Sir," he said, "I'm going to close this complaint as unfounded. I'm sorry for your time." He shook my hand and left. 2 weeks later, a noise complaint was filed with the local police department. The complaint alleged excessive noise disturbance from our property at approximately 4:10 p.m. on a Wednesday. 2 officers arrived and knocked on the door, I answered, bewildered. They had received a noise complaint. The source of the noise? My son shooting basketball hoops in the driveway after school? I showed the officers the driveway. My son, who was 9 years old, had been bouncing a basketball. The officers, both of them, told me they were sorry and drove away. One of them looked back at Linda's house as they left. He didn't say anything, but I understood the look. It kept going. In April, Linda called the city's nuisance property line claiming she had observed excessive vehicle traffic coming and going from our address, suggesting possible unlicensed business activity. The follow-up inspector who visited noted that our excessive traffic consisted of my mother-in-law visiting twice a week. In June, she filed a complaint with the water district claiming we were potentially violating lawn irrigation ordinances. An inspector came, checked our setup, and confirmed we were watering on the correct days at the correct times. But the most unhinged escalation came in October. A fire marshal knocked on our door on a Tuesday morning. He was professional, steady, the kind of person who has seen a lot and doesn't rattle a silly. He explained that a concerned citizen had filed a report alleging that our home posed a potential fire hazard due to the suspected storage of flammable and combustible materials in an attached garage in quantities exceeding residential ordinance limits. He asked to inspect the garage. I opened it for him. Inside, a riding lawnmower, a box of holiday decorations, a folding table, 2 bicycles, a bag of mulch, a snowblower, and several cans of interior latex paint, the water-based kind, purchased from a hardware store, completely legal in any quantity in a residential garage. The fire marshal walked through the garage slowly, clipboard in hand. He checked the paint cans. He checked the mower. He stood in the middle of the garage for a moment. Then he turned to me and said, "And I will never forget this, sir. I want to be straightforward with you. We know who is filing these reports. This is the 7th complaint we have received from this address in the past 10 months. All of them have been unfounded. There is nothing we can do without a legitimate violation, and there is no violation here. But I want you to know that we are aware of the pattern and we are documenting it on our end as well. I'm sorry you're dealing with this. 7 complaints in 10 months. Fire marshals, code inspectors, police officers, all of them showing up at my home, interrupting my family's life. Because one woman across the street had decided that we did not belong. I went inside after the fire marshal left, sat down at my desk, and opened a new spreadsheet on my computer. I had been keeping a personal log since month 4. Now I started organizing it into something more formal. Dates, complaint, types, agencies contacted, response outcomes, fine amounts, every piece of paper, every email, every certified letter, all of it, documented and organized. So I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew I was going to need it. The attorney's name was Patricia Weston. A neighbor's cousin had recommended her. She specialized in property disputes and HOA law, and she had a reputation for being methodical and unimpressed by bravado. Sarah and I sat across from her in a conference room with a folder that was now nearly 2 inches thick. Violation notices, fine receipts, complaint logs, city, inspector reports, dates, times, and descriptions going back nearly 2 years. Patricia flipped through it without expression for about 15 minutes while we sat quietly. Finally, she looked up. "This is actually a very strong file," she said. "Tell me everything from the beginning." We talked for 2 hours. Patricia took notes. She asked clarifying questions, precise, specific, legal questions. At the end of the meeting, she told us 3 things that fundamentally changed how we saw our situation. First, several of the fines Linda had issued were procedurally invalid. Under the HOA's own bylaws, violation fines above a certain dollar amount required a full board vote before they could be levied. Linda, acting as a single officer, had been issuing fines unilaterally. That meant a significant portion of the money we had paid was potentially recoverable. Second, 2 of the violations Linda had cited, including the infamous Sightline Corridor complaint, referenced sections of the community guidelines that had been amended and removed in a 2019 bylaw revision. Linda had been enforcing rules that no longer legally existed. Third, the pattern of city complaints, 7 in 10 months, all unfounded, constituted a documented pattern of behavior that, combined with the surveillance log Dave had described, could form the basis of a civil harassment claim. "You've been playing defense for 2 years," Patricia said. "That ends now." She advised us to begin attending every HOA meeting and to do so visibly and systematically. We were to request the floor for public comment, ask pointed questions about fine procedures, and request copies of all meeting minutes under the state's open records provisions. We were to be polite, professional, and relentless. We followed her instructions exactly. The first HOA meeting we attended had 7 people. Linda was running it as though she owned the room. When I raised my hand during open comment and asked, calmly and specifically, which board members had co-signed the last 4 violation notices issued to our property, the room went very quiet. Linda said the meeting wasn't the appropriate venue for individual grievances. I said politely that according to Section 5 of the bylaws, public comment on compliance procedures was explicitly permitted at any regular board meeting. I cited the section number, I had read the entire 47-page handbook, every single page, highlighted and tabbed. Over the next 4 months, other neighbors began quietly reaching out to us. The young couple in Unit 12 told us Linda had filed so many complaints against them that their homeowner's insurance had flagged the address. They had sold and moved at a loss just to escape. A retired teacher named Constance told us about the 3 times her car had been towed from her own driveway after Linda filed parking complaints, despite the fact that Constance had lived there for 9 years without a single prior issue. And then there was the family with the trampoline. A family named the Hoakaren had moved in 3 years before us. They had 3 young kids. Linda had filed a complaint about their trampoline, claiming it violated safety ordinances. When the trampoline complaint went nowhere, it was entirely legal. Linda had filed a report with the County Child Protective Services, claiming she had observed conditions of concern at the home. CPS had investigated. They found a normal, loving family with a trampoline. When the Hoakaren told us that story, Sarah and I sat in their kitchen and didn't speak for a long moment. Because CPS's involvement, even when unfounded, goes on a record. It creates paperwork. It causes stress that no family should have to experience. The neighborhood was waking up. People who had been silent for years, because they didn't want to become Linda's next target, were starting to talk to each other. What had felt like a series of isolated incidents was starting to look like something much more systematic. Patricia was building a case. We were building a coalition. And Linda had no idea that either was happening. It was a Tuesday evening in November, Year 3, and the weather was cold and clear. The HOA meetings were held in the community room of the neighborhood clubhouse, a small building with folding chairs and fluorescent lights that usually drew maybe 6 or 8 people on a good night. That night, there were 23. People had driven home from work and come straight. Constance had brought her neighbor. The Hoakaren were there with their eldest daughter. Dave sat in the back row in his winter coat, arms folded. 2 other families I recognized but hadn't spoken to yet had come. And all of us had been careful, at Patricia's advice, not to coordinate in writing or appear to be organized as a group. We were simply 23 individual community members exercising our right to attend a public HOA meeting. Linda walked in at exactly 7 p.m., binder under her arm, lanyard on, clipboard. She scanned the room, and I watched her face process the turnout. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered behind her eyes. Then the mask went back up, and she smiled her tight, controlled smile. "Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see such strong community engagement." She called the meeting to order and moved briskly through the agenda: maintenance updates, the holiday decoration schedule, a proposed change to guest parking hours. She was moving fast, trying to get through the procedural items before open comment. But she couldn't skip open comment. It was in the bylaws. When she opened the floor, I stood up first. I stated my name and address for the record. I explained that I had a formal grievance to present regarding HOA fine procedures and asked that it be entered into the meeting minutes. Patricia had prepared a 5-page document. I placed copies on every chair before the meeting. Linda was looking at it now, and I could see her jaw tighten. The document laid out, in precise and unemotional language, the procedural violations in the fines we had received, the lack of board co-signature, the citations of outdated bylaws, the dollar amounts involved. Then Constance stood up. She presented her towing incidents: 3 unauthorized tows over 2 years, all traceable to complaints filed by the same person, totaling nearly $800 in costs she had absorbed. Then a man named Robert, who I had never spoken to before that night, stood up and described how Linda had filed a complaint with the county health department about his backyard compost bin, a complaint that resulted in a $400 fine before he successfully appealed it. Story after story, one after another. The room was completely still except for the voices. Linda tried to interrupt twice. The first time, Gerald, quiet, tired Gerald, who had been HOA president for 6 years and had clearly been hoping to simply outlast this situation, reminded her, gently but firmly, that open comment time was protected under the bylaws. The second time she tried to speak over someone, 3 people simultaneously said, "Point of order." Then a retired paralegal named Miriam, who lived 2 streets over and whom I had never met before Patricia connected us, stood up and presented the results of an informal audit she had conducted after filing a public records request for all HOA financial records going back 3 years. The audit had found $14,200 in fines that had been issued without proper board authorization, collected from 17 different households. $14,000. 17 families, 3 years. The room was silent for a moment after Miriam finished. Linda stood up. Her voice was clipped and controlled, but her hands were white on the edge of her binder. She said the audit was unofficial and inadmissible, that the meeting had become a coordinated attack, that she had served this community faithfully for 9 years, and that she would be filing formal complaints against multiple residents for conduct unbecoming a community member. Gerald let her finish. Then he took a breath. The breath of a man who has been putting something off for a very long time, and spoke. "I'm going to call for a vote of no confidence in the current compliance officer position. All in favor, please raise your hand." 19 hands went up immediately. 4 people, I assumed they were friends of Linda's, abstained. 0 voted against. Linda Marsh was removed from all HOA positions, effective immediately. Linda stood at the front of the room and did not move for what felt like a full minute. Then she picked up her binder, her clipboard, and her lanyard and walked to the door without a word. It started quiet, and then one by one, every person in that room joined in. 23 people clapping in a fluorescent-lit community room on a Tuesday night in November. It was the most satisfying sound I have ever heard. When you keep expecting the rain to start again and it doesn't, no violation notices arrived, no certified mail. The mailbox, which I had come to approach every afternoon with quiet dread, was just a mailbox again. Miriam's audit was submitted formally to the state HOA Regulatory Board, which opened an investigation. 3 months later, Linda received a formal ruling requiring her to personally reimburse $6,200 in fines that had been improperly issued. The portion that was directly attributable to her individual actions outside of board authorization, including mandatory dual signature requirements for all fines above $50. Our share was $875. It wasn't a fortune, but that wasn't really the point. The point was the letter from the state board that arrived with it, officially confirming that the fines had been unlawful. I framed a copy of that letter. It's on my wall. Patricia filed our civil harassment suit in January. We documented the false city complaints, the pattern of surveillance, the procedurally invalid fines, and the general campaign of intimidation conducted over approximately 28 months. Linda's homeowner's insurance initially disputed the claim, then agreed to a settlement in mediation. The settlement amount was confidential, as they often are, but I will say this. It covered our daughter's first year of college tuition, with a little left over for a very nice family vacation, the first real vacation we had taken since before we bought the house. The Okafor family filed their own complaint separately, focused specifically on the CPS report. That process was longer and more complicated, but they ultimately received both an apology letter from the county, which acknowledged the complaint had been made in bad faith, and their own settlement. Constance got her towing fees back. Robert got his health department fine reversed. One by one, the wrongs that Linda had accumulated over 9 years of unchecked power began to be addressed. As for Linda herself, she remained in her house across the street for about 6 months after the November meeting. Those 6 months were strange. She didn't look at us anymore, didn't stand at the window, didn't cross the street. It was as if, with the HOA removed as her instrument, she simply didn't know what to do with us. In May, almost exactly 3 years after we had moved in, a for sale sign appeared in her front yard. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning when I was leaving for work. I stood in my driveway for a moment and looked at it. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly, is more like relief, the deep, quiet exhale of something finally being over. The house sold quickly. Moving day was a Thursday in early June. I happened to be working from home that day. I saw the moving truck arrive from my home office window. I watched the movers carry boxes out, and at one point, in the early afternoon, Linda walked across the lawn toward her car carrying a box. She glanced toward our house. I was standing on my front porch with a cup of coffee. When she looked over, I raised my hand and gave her a slow, genuine, completely sincere wave. The wave of a good neighbor. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked away, got in her car, and drove off without a word. I went back inside. I walked to the closet in the hallway, the one where we had been keeping a certain ceramic garden gnome for the past 2.5 years. I picked him up, carried him out the front door, walked down the porch steps, and across the front lawn. I set him down right in the center of the flower bed. No tape measure, no handbook, no color swatch comparison, no checking zones or corridors or sight lines. Just a small gnome with a painted smile, 11 inches tall, standing exactly where I wanted him to stand, in the garden of a house that was mine. Looked at the "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, and I thought, yes, finally. And that, my friends, is what justice looks like.